A deal worth $500 million hung in the balance, trapped in the gilded silence of a private dining room. On one side of the table sat two of the most ruthless executives in the tech industry. On the other, an enigmatic Japanese millionaire, Ilara Vance, who refused to speak a single word of English. They saw her silence as weakness, her foreign words as nonsense. They smirked, they whispered, they belittled her, confident in their superiority. They believed they were in complete control. What they didn't know was that their every sneer and every lie was being watched by the one person in the room. They never even noticed the waitress. The air in the private dining room of Aurelia, one of downtown Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was thick enough to be cut with the sterling silver knives laid on the table. It was an atmosphere of forced patience, a palpable tension simmering beneath a veneer of corporate civility. The room was a statement in itself. Walls paneled with dark, polished mahogany. A crystal chandelier that dripped light onto the table like frozen tears, and a single vast window offering a godlike view of the sprawling city lights below. On one side of the expansive table sat Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne. Richard, the CEO of Sterling Innovations, was a man in his late 50s with a mane of silver hair that looked meticulously sculpted and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating blue eyes. He exuded an aura of old money and unshakable power. Beside him, his vice president of acquisitions, Marcus, was a younger, sleeker version of the same predator. His suit was sharper, his smile wider, but his eyes held the same hungry glint. They were here to close the deal of a lifetime, the acquisition of Vance Robotics, a Japanese firm at the forefront of bio-integrative AI. And on the other side of the table was the reason for their anxiety. Ilara Vance. She was not what they had expected. Her name, Vance, was from a brief, long-ago marriage to an American academic, but her entire being was a portrait of Japanese grace and austerity. She was perhaps in her late 60s, her posture ramrod straight, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple, elegant knot. She wore a modest, dark silk dress, unadorned with any jewelry, save for a simple jade ring. Her face, a mask of calm impassivity, gave away nothing. Accompanying her was her trusted aide, a younger man named David Chen, who sat slightly behind her, his expression a perfect mirror of his employer's stoicism. The problem began the moment she arrived, after the initial greetings facilitated by David Ilara Vance had spoken. But her words were not the crisp, accented English they were prepared for. They were Japanese, soft, melodic, and utterly incomprehensible to Richard and Marcus. Mr. Sterling, Ms. Vance is pleased to be here and appreciates you hosting this dinner. David had translated his own English impeccable. Richard had forced a laugh. Of course, a pleasure. Please tell her we are honored. As the appetizers were served, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops and yuzu foam, Richard tried again. Ms. Vance, your work in neural interfacing is simply revolutionary. We believe that combined with our global distribution network, we can change the world. He paused, beaming, waiting for the translation. David leaned in, murmured to Ilara in Japanese, and she responded with a short, quiet phrase. David turned back. Ms. Vance understands the potential synergies. The conversation, if it could be called that, continued in this stilted, frustrating manner for nearly an hour. Richard and Marcus would deliver a paragraph of enthusiastic corporate flattery, which David would condense into a whisper, receiving a one-sentence reply that he would then translate back. It was like trying to play tennis with a brick wall. Marcus was losing his patience. He leaned towards Richard, cupping his hand to his mouth in a poor attempt at subtlety. What is this, Richard? Is this some kind of power play? Forcing us to go through him for everything she's making us beg. Richard's smile was tight, a mask of professionalism cracking at the edges. Stay calm, Marcus. This is how they do business. It's about respect hierarchy. Just play the game. The prize is worth $500 million. But it felt like more than a game. Elara Vance's eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to follow their every move. She rarely looked at David when he translated, but instead watched them, her gaze unwavering. It was unnerving. She would occasionally say something directly to them, a stream of Japanese that sounded like a question, her head tilted slightly. Each time they would look at David with panicked helplessness. She asks if you enjoyed your recent holiday in the Caribbean, Mr. Sterling. David would translate, his face unreadable. Richard would blink, caught off guard. Oh. Yes, it was wonderful, very relaxing. How did she? And she notes that your company's stock fell 2 points this afternoon after the quarterly projections were leaked, Mr. Thorne. David would continue relaying another of Elara's soft-spoken observations. Marcus's face would pale slightly. They were being dissected, analyzed, and the woman holding the scalpel was speaking a language that rendered them completely powerless. Their frustration was curdling into a dangerous mix of anger and arrogance. They were the titans of industry here, not her. This was their city, their restaurant, their deal, and they were being made to feel like fools. Chloe adjusted the crisp white apron around her waist, her movements practiced and silent as she moved along the periphery of the private dining room. She was a ghost in this opulent world, trained to be invisible. Her job was to anticipate needs before they were spoken to, refill a water glass the moment it dipped below halfway, to clear a plate with the stealth of a cat, to exist as a pair of hands, not a person. But Chloe was a watcher. It was how she survived not just the grueling shifts at Aurelia, but life. She noticed the slight tremor in Marcus Thorne's hand as he reached for his wine, a sign of agitation he was trying to suppress. She saw the way Richard Sterling's affable smile was a thin, brittle shell over a chasm of impatience. Most of all, she watched Elara Vance. To Richard and Marcus, the woman was an obstacle, a bizarre, foreign enigma. To Chloe, she was something else entirely. She was familiar. Chloe had grown up in Kyoto. Her father was a cultural attaché at the American Embassy, a quiet academic who had fallen in love with the country and raised his daughter there for 15 years. She had attended a local Japanese school, her days filled with the rigorous cadence of the language, her friendships forged in its nuances. Japanese wasn't just a second language to her. It was the language of her childhood, of scraped knees and first heartbreaks, of whispered secrets with her best friend Aiko. It was the language she still dreamt in, sometimes. Now working 2 jobs to pay her way through a fine arts degree at NYU those years felt a lifetime away. Here she was, just Chloe, the quiet waitress. No one knew that the soft flowing words spoken by Elara Vance were as clear as day to her, and what she heard made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She heard the translations David Chen provided, and they were accurate, but they were also incomplete. They were literal. They were the sterile, functional words of a professional interpreter. What they lacked was the soul, the subtle honorifics, the intricate subtext that was woven into every syllable Elara Vance spoke. When Elara had asked about Richard's vacation, her tone hadn't been merely inquisitive. There was a layer of polite, almost surgical precision, a phrase that subtly implied, "I know you were conducting unofficial business on that trip." When she had mentioned Marcus's stock, dropping her choice of words was not just an observation. It was a delicate yet unmistakable expression of disappointment, the kind a teacher might use for a promising student who had failed a simple test. She was speaking in a highly formal, almost courtly dialect of Japanese one that conveyed immense authority and intellect. Chloe watched as Marcus, growing bolder with his frustration, launched a new tactic, a condescendingly simple English spoken loudly, as if Alara were deaf or simple-minded. "We are offering you a very good price," he said, holding up his fingers. "Lots of money." Chloe flinched. The insult was so profound, so deeply ignorant, that she felt a phantom sting of shame on his behalf. She saw Alara Vance's eyes for a fraction of a second flicker with something that looked like pain. Not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. David Chen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, translating Marcus's boorish words dutifully. Alara responded, her voice still quiet, but with an edge, a sharpness that wasn't there before. David translated, "Ms. Vance understands the financial offer." But what Alara had actually said was, "Please tell this child that the buzzing of a fly is more disruptive to my thoughts than his shouting." Chloe nearly dropped the silver water pitcher she was holding. She steadied herself against the wall, her heart hammering. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a disaster. These men, in their blind arrogance, were dismantling a $500 million deal with every condescending word. And Alara Vance was letting them. She was observing their disrespect, cataloguing it, her silence a vessel for their contempt. The final straw came when Richard, convinced that the woman across from him was either playing a foolish game or was genuinely incompetent, decided to discuss strategy with Marcus openly right at the table. "Look, this is going nowhere," Richard muttered, leaning across the table as if Alara and David were merely furniture. "Let's just get to the final offer. We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. She clearly can't manage them if this is how she behaves. We can absorb them into our own structure and save 20 million off the top. She'll never even know the difference. Just tell her it's a streamlined final offer." Marcus grinned, a flash of predatory teeth. "Brilliant. She's lost in her own world. He'll just translate whatever we tell him to." Chloe stood frozen by the service door, the cold metal of the handle pressing into her back. They were going to defraud her, right here in front of her, using her own childhood language as a shield for their deceit. They assumed her inability to speak English equated to an inability to understand complex deal structures. They saw a woman, not a titan. They saw a foreigner, not a genius. And in that moment, Chloe felt the 15 years in Kyoto rise up in her. She remembered her father teaching her that silence in Japan could be a sign of respect, of deep thought, of strength. It was not a vacuum to be filled with noise and arrogance. She looked at Alara Vance's face, at the profound, lonely intelligence in her eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in her own grandmother's eyes, after her grandfather passed away, a woman surrounded by people who only saw her as a frail widow, not the pillar of strength she was. Her manager's voice echoed in her head. "You are invisible, Chloe. Do not speak to the guests unless spoken to. Ever." It was the cardinal rule. Breaking it meant instant dismissal. It meant rent wouldn't get paid. It meant her dream of finishing her degree would evaporate. But then she heard Alara Vance speak again, her voice almost a whisper. And this time it was not directed at the men. It was a soft, forlorn murmur almost to herself. "Is there no one here Who sees? Chloe's decision was made. Her job, her future, they felt small compared to the colossal injustice unfolding in this gilded cage. She pushed off the door, smoothed her apron, and walked toward the table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As Chloe approached the table, the world seemed to slow down. Each step on the plush Persian rug was a deliberate act of defiance. The clinking of cutlery, the low hum of the city outside, everything faded into a muted background buzz. All that mattered were the four figures at the table locked in their tableau of misunderstanding and deceit. Richard and Marcus didn't even notice her at first. They were too busy smirking at each other, confident in their scheme. David Chen's head was bowed slightly, a portrait of resignation. Only Alara Vance's eyes lifted to meet Chloe's. For a fleeting second, Chloe saw a flicker of surprise in them, a momentary crack in the serene facade. Chloe stopped not beside Richard or Marcus, but at a respectful distance from Alara's side of the table. She took a slow, deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned air, feeling thin in her lungs. This was it. She bowed. Not a deferential servant's nod, but a deep, formal bow from the waist, the kind she hadn't performed in years. It was a bow of profound respect, one reserved for an elder, a teacher, a person of immense status. The gesture was so unexpected, it sliced through the room's tension. Richard and Marcus stopped talking, their heads snapping in her direction. "What the hell is this?" Marcus muttered, a sneer twisting his lips. "Can we get some more wine here? Or—" His voice trailed off as Chloe straightened up, looked directly at Alara Vance, and spoke. Her Japanese was flawless. It was the Kyoto dialect of her youth, formal, humble, and clear as a temple bell. "Vance-sama." She began using the highest form of address, one that bordered on reverence. "Forgive my unforgivable impudence. I am but a humble servant here. However, to stand by and witness this discourtesy is a stain upon this house and my own honor. If you would permit me, I can help." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a stunned, deafening void. Richard and Marcus stared at her, their mouths literally agape. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly recited Shakespeare. This girl, the one who had been silently refilling their water, who they hadn't given a second glance, was speaking the very language that had been their wall of frustration all evening. David Chen's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Chloe to Alara, his professional composure completely shattered for the first time. But the most profound reaction came from Alara Vance herself. The impassive mask she had worn all night crumbled. Her eyes, which had held a universe of lonely wisdom, welled up with sudden glistening tears. Her lips parted slightly, and a small, choked sound escaped her. It was a sound of immense, soul-shattering relief. It was the sound of a prisoner who, after years in solitary confinement, finally hears a voice speaking their native tongue. She responded to Chloe, her own voice, thick with emotion, yet still retaining its innate elegance. You understand?" She asked, her words a fragile whisper. "You understand what has been said?" "The meaning behind the words. I understand everything." "Vance-sama." Chloe replied, her own voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I grew up in Kyoto. I hear not only your words, but your heart." This exchange, lasting no more than 10 seconds, completely reconfigured the power dynamic in the room. Richard and Marcus were no longer in control. They were outsiders, locked out of a conversation that was suddenly flowing with more genuine emotion and meaning than anything they had managed in 2 hours. "What is she saying?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. He pointed a finger at Chloe. "Who are you? What did you say to her?" Chloe did not look at him. Her attention remained entirely on Elara. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a conduit, a bridge over a chasm of cultural ignorance. Elara. Vance, with tears now tracing silent paths down her cheeks, gestured a frail, elegant hand toward the empty chair beside her. It was an invitation, an order. She spoke again, a short, clear sentence in Japanese. David Chen, finally finding his voice translated for the bewildered executives, though his eyes were fixed on Chloe with a look of awe. Ms. Vance requests that the young lady join them at the table." Marcus scoffed in disbelief. "Join them? She's the waitress. This is insane." But Richard Sterling, for all his arrogance, was a man who understood power, and he could feel it shifting in the room as surely as a tide. The quiet Japanese woman was no longer a passive object. She had found a voice, and that voice belonged to the girl in the white apron. He fell silent, watching his mind racing to calculate this new, impossible variable. Chloe hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a quiet grace she didn't know she possessed, she pulled out the chair and sat down. The world had just turned upside down, and somehow she was at its center. Seated at the mahogany table, the fine linen of the napkin feeling alien in her lap, Chloe felt a profound sense of surreality. The crystal glasses, the ornate silverware, the half-eaten plates of Michelin-starred food, they were artifacts from a world she served, not one she inhabited. Yet the gaze of Elara Vance anchored her, imbuing her with a purpose that dwarfed her anxieties. Richard and Marcus watched their faces a mixture of confusion and fury. This was a flagrant breach of every protocol they understood. "I think we deserve an explanation," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. He addressed David Chen, but his glare was fixed on Chloe. "What is going on?" Before David could speak, Elara addressed Chloe directly in Japanese. Her voice now calm and imbued with a quiet authority. Chloe listened intently, then turned her gaze to the two American executives. For the first time, she spoke to them, her voice clear and measured. "My name is Chloe. Ms. Vance has asked me to translate for her." She paused, letting the simple statement land. "She feels it is time for you to understand the full context of this meeting." David Chen nodded slowly, giving Chloe his tacit permission. He understood. His role as a purely professional translator was insufficient for what was needed now. What was needed was a human connection. Chloe turned back to Elara, who began to speak. She didn't speak of business of robotics or stock prices. She spoke of a rainy Tuesday in Tokyo 6 months ago. She spoke of a black car, a slick road, and the screech of tires that was the last thing she remembered before waking up in a world of muted colors and confusing sounds. As Elara spoke, Chloe translated her voice, becoming a vessel for the older woman's pain and frustration. 6 months ago. Chloe began her words, painting a stark picture in the opulent room. Ms. Vance was in a serious car accident. She sustained a traumatic brain injury, specifically to the parts of her brain that control language processing, Broca's and Wernicke's areas. She paused. Richard and Marcus exchanged a look of disbelief. Her cognitive functions. Chloe continued, the words flowing through her memory, her intelligence, her brilliant engineering mind. They are all perfectly intact. She is the same woman who built a global empire from nothing, but the injury has caused a specific and rare form of expressive aphasia. Chloe took a breath, ensuring she conveyed the gravity of the situation exactly as Alara was expressing it. When she is under stress, her brain defaults. It reverts to its most fundamental pathways. For her, that is her native language. The English she learned in her 20s is inaccessible, a locked room in her own mind. The more she tries to force the words, the more they slip away. The story hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Alara Vance was not being difficult. She was not playing a power game. She was wounded. She was trapped inside her own brilliant mind, able to understand everything, but unable to command the language her audience required. Why wasn't this disclosed? Marcus blurted out, his tone more accusatory than sympathetic. We've been wasting our time here. Alara's eyes flashed, and she spoke a sharp, single sentence. Dignity is not a line item in a quarterly report. Chloe translated her voice as sharp as Alara's. Ms. Vance did not want to be defined by her injury. She did not want pity, nor did she want to be seen as a liability by the company she dedicated her life to building. This deal is not just an acquisition for her. It is her legacy. She has to know that the people she is entrusting it to are people of character, not just opportunists. Chloe's translation was imbued with the fierce pride she heard in Alara's Japanese. She came here tonight to look you in the eye, to gauge your character, your patience, your empathy. She believes you can learn more about a person from how they act when they are confused than when they are comfortable. A wave of shame so potent it was almost visible should have washed over Richard and Marcus. Their condescension, their loud, slow-talking insults, their whispered conspiracy to cheat her, all of it had been a test they had failed spectacularly. But shame was not a currency Richard Sterling dealt in. He saw not a tragedy, but an opening, a weakness to be exploited. His mind, ever the calculator, was already re-evaluating the deal based on this new information. A vulnerable seller, a seller with a brain injury. He leaned forward, his earlier frustration replaced by a slick, predatory sympathy. Miss Vance. Alara. My God, that's terrible. We had no idea. Please accept our deepest apologies. Of course we understand. And we want to help. His eyes gleamed. In fact, this makes everything so much simpler. We can take the burden off your shoulders. We can expedite the deal, handle the details, so you can focus on your recovery. There's no need to trouble you with the complex clauses and performance metrics. Marcus quickly caught on his expression, shifting to one of mock concern. Yes, absolutely. The last thing you need is more stress. We can sign a letter of intent tonight, a simple one, just to get the ball rolling, for your own good. Chloe felt a chill creep up her spine as she translated their words. She relayed the meaning, the sympathetic tone, but she also saw the truth behind their eyes. They were sharks that had just scented blood in the water. They weren't seeing a person to be respected. They were seeing a target to be taken down. Alara Vance listened to the translation, her face unreadable once more. She then looked at Chloe, and in her eyes, Chloe saw a flicker of the same weary disappointment she had seen earlier. The test was not over. In fact, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. The dinner was no longer a dinner. It was a battlefield, and Chloe, the waitress, was now standing on the front line, armed with nothing but her understanding of 2 languages and a growing sense of dread. The air, which had briefly cleared with the honesty of Alara's confession, was now thick with a new kind of poison predatory opportunism. Richard slid a leather-bound folder from his briefcase and placed it in the center of the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "This is our revised offer," he announced, his voice smooth as silk. "It's simplified, much more straightforward. It accelerates the payout and places the operational transition entirely in our hands. It's a turnkey solution designed for your peace of mind, Elara." He was using her first name now. The false intimacy was nauseating. Chloe felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was a fine art student. She knew about Renaissance painters and modernist sculpture, not leveraged buyouts and equity transfers. But she had to try. She had to be more than a mouthpiece. Elara gestured for Chloe to examine the document. As Chloe picked it up, she felt the weight of it. The cold, smooth paper filled with dense, legalistic text. She began to read the key clauses aloud to Elara in Japanese, her voice slow and careful. As she did, she could feel Richard and Marcus watching her, their patience already wearing thin. "Clause 7b," Richard interrupted, "is a standard indemnity clause, just legal boilerplate. We can skip that." "Section 12, Marcus added, just outlines the redundancy protocols for her executive team. It's really just a formality." They were trying to direct her to control the flow of information, but as Chloe read, certain phrases snagged her attention. She had spent enough late nights helping her diplomat father proofread documents to recognize the scent of deliberately obtuse language. "One moment," Chloe said, holding up a hand. She looked at Elara and switched to Japanese. "Vance-sama. They are glossing over these sections, but the language here is evasive. Clause 7b is not a standard indemnity clause. It appears to give their company unilateral power to renegotiate all of Vance Robotics' existing intellectual property licenses after the merger. They could sell off your core patents." Elara's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She gave a slight nod for Chloe to continue. "And Section 12, Chloe went on, her heart pounding, "is not about redundancy. It's a non-compete clause, but it is written so broadly that it would not only prevent your top executives from working elsewhere, it would effectively prevent you personally from engaging in any related technological endeavors for a period of 10 years. They are trying to buy not just your company, but your future." Chloe was no longer just translating. She was analyzing. She was protecting. With every sentence she decoded, she felt a surge of adrenaline. The two powerful men at the table suddenly seemed smaller, their expensive suits and confident smiles, nothing more than cheap camouflage for their greed. Richard was becoming agitated. "What's the hold-up? What are you telling her? Just tell her it's a standard agreement." Chloe met his glare, her own expression unyielding. "I am ensuring Ms. Vance understands the full and precise meaning of every clause, Mr. Sterling. As you can appreciate, clarity is paramount in a deal of this magnitude." Her formal corporate language coming from a waitress seemed to stun him into momentary silence. Elara then posed a question in Japanese, her tone deceptively light. Chloe translated. "Ms. Vance is curious about the revised valuation of the company's R&D division. The initial offer had it pegged at $100 million. In this new document, that figure appears to be absent, folded into a general assets category." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "It's a clerical simplification. The overall number is what matters. It's all in there, don't worry." Elara spoke again, her words soft, but carrying the weight of steel. Chloe's translation was precise. "Vance-sama says that in her experience, when a number of that size becomes silent, it is rarely for clerical reasons. She asks you to point to the exact line item where the value of her life's research is accounted for. A bead of sweat trickled down Marcus Thorne's temple. He and Richard began flipping through their copies of the document, a frantic rustling sound that filled the room. They were flustered. They had assumed their opponent was incapacitated, that the translator was a simple tool. They had never expected such surgical, informed questioning. They had never expected Chloe. Elara Vance sat back in her chair, a picture of absolute calm. She took a delicate sip of her tea. For the first time all evening, a tiny, almost imperceptible whistle touched the corners of her lips. She was not the wounded animal they had perceived. She was a hunter, and she had just watched her prey walk confidently into a trap of their own making. Chloe realized with a jolt that Elara's questions weren't just for information. She already knew the answers. She understood the contract perfectly. The aphasia affected her ability to speak English, not to read it. She hadn't needed a translator for the words on the page. She had needed one for the men in the room. She had needed a witness. The entire evening, the silence, the confusion, her apparent vulnerability, it had all been the most elaborate high-stakes character test imaginable. And now it was time for the final exam. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. The cloying scent of predatory confidence had been replaced by the acrid smell of panic. Richard and Marcus were whispering furiously to each other, their heads bent over the contract, unable to find the justification they needed. Their carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling into dust. Elara Vance watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Chloe and began to speak. Her Japanese was different now. The soft, formal tones were gone, replaced by a voice that was crisp, commanding, and utterly resolute. It was the voice of a CEO, a leader, a woman who had bent the male-dominated world of technology to her will. Chloe listened, her eyes wide. The instructions were specific, the message devastatingly clear. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and prepared to deliver the final blow. She turned to Richard and Marcus, whose frantic whispering ceased as they saw the look on her face. "Gentlemen," Chloe began, her voice ringing with an authority that was not entirely her own, "Ms. Vance has instructed me to convey her final decision." She let the words hang in the air, the silence stretching into an uncomfortable eternity. "First," Chloe said, her gaze locking onto Richard, "regarding your attempt to bury the intellectual property clause, Ms. Vance recognizes this as a blatant attempt to asset strip her company, effectively stealing the core technology patents that are the soul of Vance Robotics. She considers this not just a breach of good faith, but a profound personal insult." Richard's face went pale. "Second," Chloe continued, turning to Marcus, "regarding the deceptively worded non-compete clause. Ms. Vance finds it amusing. The suggestion that she would allow a man like you, who cannot even read his own balance sheet without leaking it, to dictate the terms of her life's work, is, in her words, the pinnacle of delusional arrogance." Marcus looked as if he had been physically struck. "And third," Chloe said, her voice dropping slightly, "regarding the deliberate obfuscation of the R&D division's value. That division is currently developing Project Chimera, a technology you are not even aware of, which has a projected market value far exceeding this entire company. Your attempt to acquire it for nothing is noted." The two men were speechless, utterly defeated. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and laid bare by the very woman they had dismissed as a confused old foreigner. But the masterstroke was yet to come. Elara spoke one final time, in Japanese, a short, simple phrase. As she did, her aide David Chen, who had been silent for over an hour, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. He placed it on the table and pressed a button. Richard's voice, tinny and distorted, filled the silent room. "Let's just get to the final offer. We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. We can absorb them into our own structure and save 20 million off the top. She'll never even know the difference." Marcus's voice followed, dripping with contempt. "Brilliant. She's lost in her own world." The recording played their entire whispered conversation, every greedy, dismissive and fraudulent word echoing in the opulent dining room like a death sentence. When it finished, a profound silence descended. Richard Sterling looked ashen, his silver hair suddenly seeming less distinguished and more like the mark of an old, tired fool. Marcus Thorne was staring at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. And then the final miracle happened. Elara Vance looked across the table directly at Richard and Marcus. She leaned forward slightly, and in a voice that was quiet, raspy from disuse, but perfectly chillingly clear, she spoke her first English words of the night. "I believe," she said, her accent a faint, elegant melody, "this negotiation is over." The shock was absolute. It was a thunderclap in a silent church. The locked room in her mind had been opened. Perhaps it was the release of stress, the adrenaline of victory, or simply the sheer force of her will. But she had broken through the aphasia. She stood up, her posture regal. David Chen held her chair. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Chloe, a gesture of immense gratitude and shared victory. Then, without another glance at the two ruined men, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of a $500 million deal and two careers that were for all intents and purposes finished. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest noise Chloe had ever heard. Of course, here is a rewritten and significantly expanded version of Part 7, delving deeper into the emotional and psychological aftermath for Chloe, drawing out the tension and making the life-changing offer a more detailed and profound moment. Chloe stood alone in the private dining room, a ghost in a gilded cage that had suddenly become a tomb. The silence left in Elara Vance's wake was not peaceful. It was a physical presence, a high-pitched ringing in her ears that was the sound of her life teetering on a knife's edge. The rich scent of roasted duck and truffle oil now seemed cloying and decadent, the smell of a world she had just violated. Richard and Marcus had vanished, like apparitions, their panicked retreat, leaving behind a tangible aura of disgrace. They had left everything, briefcases agape, pens, and the fraudulent contract sitting squarely in the center of the table, a monument to their greed. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses and steadied her voice began its cruel retreat, leaving a cold, trembling weakness in its place. She reached out and touched the back of the mahogany chair she had sat in the wood, still warm. It was the only thing that felt real. Had that all just happened? Had she? Chloe, a fine arts student who supplemented her ramen noodle diet by serving canapes to the 1% just committed career suicide in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic question. What have I done? What have I done? The cardinal rule, the one branded into every server at Aurelia, screamed in her mind. You are invisible. You are silent. You do not exist. She had not only existed, she had appointed herself judge, jury, and translator. The service door swung open with a violent slam, and her manager, a severe man named Mr. Dubois, with a perpetually pinched face, stormed into the room. His face was a mottled shade of crimson, his eyes blazing with a fury that made Chloe's blood run cold. Chloe, he hissed his voice, a low, dangerous weapon. He didn't shout. It was far more terrifying than that. Do you have any idea what you have just done? Chloe stood frozen, her hands clasped behind her back, in a posture of ingrained servitude. Mr. Dubois, I can explain. Explain. He let out a short, incredulous laugh that had no humor in it. Explain what? How you decided to abandon your post. How you took it upon yourself to sit down. Sit down with a guest in the middle of a private dinner. I have Richard Sterling's chief of staff on the phone, screaming so loud I'm surprised the crystal in here hasn't shattered. He's threatening to sue not just you, but this entire restaurant for breach of privacy, for unprofessional conduct, for God knows what else. He advanced on her, his steps menacing on the plush carpet. Our reputation is built on discretion, on silent, perfect service. And you, in 10 minutes, have potentially destroyed it. You are fired, of course. That is a given. But I assure you, you will be so blacklisted in this city, you won't be able to get a job washing dishes in a back-alley diner. Pack your things. Get out of my sight. Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her precarious life in New York. Her tuition payment was due in 3 weeks. Her rent was already late. The dream of one day curating a gallery of a life surrounded by art and beauty dissolved into a terrifying vision of eviction notices and crushing debt. She had acted on principle, on a deep-seated sense of justice, and this was her reward. Ruin. As Chloe opened her mouth to speak, though she had no words to offer, the dining room door opened again, this time with a soft, deliberate click. David Chen stood on the threshold, his presence instantly commanding the space. His suit was immaculate, his expression utterly calm, but his eyes held a cold fire that made Mr. Dubois's theatrical rage look childish. I believe you are mistaken, David said, his voice quiet, yet carrying an authority that sliced through the manager's tirade. He took a step into the room, his gaze fixed on Mr. Dubois. Miss Chloe was not acting on her own accord. She was acting on a direct and explicit request from my employer, Ms. Elara Vance. Mr. Dubois blinked, his momentum broken. What? That's impossible. She was providing a service that neither you nor your esteemed guests were equipped to offer clarity and respect. David continued, his tone unwavering. He took another step, and the manager instinctively took one back. The power dynamic had been redrawn in an instant. As for Mr. Sterling, I would advise him to be very careful about making threats. We have a recording of him and Mr. Thorne conspiring to commit wire fraud and contractual deception. My next call is to our legal team. His chief of staff will soon have far more pressing concerns than the conduct of a waitress. The color drained from Mr. Dubois's face. The name Vance, which before had just been a name on a reservation, now landed with the weight of a global corporation and its army of lawyers. David's attention shifted from the stunned manager to Chloe. The coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a genuine warmth and a profound look of respect that felt more valuable than any paycheck. Ms. Vance would like to speak with you. She is waiting in her car downstairs. Please come with me. He said it not as an order, but as a gentle invitation. He then turned his head slightly towards Mr. Dubois. See to it that her personal belongings are gathered and delivered to the address I will provide. She will not be returning. Without another word, he held the door open for Chloe. She walked past her former manager, who stood gaping like a fish, his authority utterly dismantled. She didn't look back. She walked through the bustling main dining room, where other servers and staff paused their work to stare whispering behind their hands. She was a curiosity, a scandal in motion. She felt their eyes on her back as she shed her white apron, folding it and placing it on a service counter, a final symbolic act of leaving that world behind. She followed David out of the gilded restaurant and into the cool, damp night air of Manhattan. At the curb, a sleek black Rolls-Royce was purring its engine, a barely audible hum. It wasn't just a car. It was a vessel from another dimension, a silent, imposing statement of power. David opened the rear door, and Chloe, feeling as though she were stepping into a dream, slid inside. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, and the chaotic symphony of the city. The swans, the horns, the chatter was instantly muted, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. The interior was cavernous, smelling of rich leather and the subtle clean scent of jasmine. Across from her, illuminated by the soft glow of the cabin lights and the passing street lamps, sat Elara Vance. She looked tired, her face etched with a weariness that hadn't been there in the restaurant. The immense effort of the evening of maintaining her composure, of forcing her mind to reclaim a language held captive by trauma, had clearly taken its toll. She leaned her head back against the plush headrest. Her eyes closed for a long moment. When she opened them, they were fixed on Chloe, and they were filled with a deep, soulful gratitude. The silence Elara began her English quiet, but steady, each word seeming to cost her a small measure of energy. It is a very lonely place, Chloe. For 6 months I have been adrift in it. People either shout at me as if I am a fool, or they speak about me as if I am not there. Tonight, you gave me my voice back, not just by speaking my language, but by hearing what I did not say. Chloe was overwhelmed, twisting her hands in her lap. I don't know what to say, Ms. Vance. I thought I was going to be fired. I was terrified. I grew up in Kyoto. My father was a diplomat, and to hear them the way they spoke to you, the disrespect, I couldn't just stand there. Elara's lips curved into a soft, genuine smile. I know. I saw it in your eyes, long before you approached the table. I saw you flinch when Mr. Thorne shouted. I saw your jaw tighten when Mr. Sterling began his conspiracy. I was watching them, but I was also watching you. She leaned forward, her intensity filling the small space. The accident changed everything for me. It showed me how quickly the world can turn on you. The moment they sense a weakness, the sharks begin to circle. My company, the legacy I have built for 40 years, is vulnerable. I need to find a successor, a partner, someone to protect it. But how can I trust anyone's motives now? Everyone who approaches me sees either a victim to be pitied or an opportunity to be exploited. The world I have found is full of Richards and Marcuses. Chloe listened, captivated, understanding that this was more than just an explanation. It was an unveiling of the woman behind the myth. I find myself in need of a person of rare character. Elara continued, her gaze unwavering. This is not a job offer for a translator. It is an offer for a new path. I need someone on my personal staff who understands nuance, who values integrity over ambition. Someone who can be my eyes and ears, who can sit in a room and see not just what is being said, but what is being felt. I need someone to be my integrity check. She let the words settle, giving Chloe a moment to absorb them. I have a foundation, Elara said, her voice filled with a new passion. The Vance Foundation for Arts and Innovation. It funds 2 things that I believe are the pillars of the future: brilliant female engineers and daring young artists. It is my true legacy. I want you to work with me there, to help me find the next generation of creators and builders, to travel with me, to be my aide, my advisor, and my confidant." She paused again, a shrewd, calculating light, the one that had built an empire, returning to her eyes. "I am aware that you are a student. Your education will not be interrupted. It will be underwritten. Your degree at NYU will be paid for in full, as will any graduate studies you wish to pursue anywhere in the world. You will be given a residence in my building, so you will not have to worry about rent, and you will be paid a salary that will ensure you and your family will never have to worry about money again. I am not offering you a job, Chloe. I am offering you a life, a platform, a chance to use your unique gift on a global stage." Chloe's mind was reeling. It was too much, too fast. Her tiny apartment with its leaky faucet, the mountain of student loan debt, the constant grinding anxiety of just trying to survive in the city, Elara was offering to wipe it all away with a few sentences. But it was more than that. It was an offer of purpose, of meaning. It was an invitation to step out of the shadows and into the light. The sheer scale of it was terrifying, a leap into an unknown, so vast, she couldn't see the other side. "Why me?" Chloe whispered the question born of a lifetime of feeling ordinary. "I'm a waitress, an art student. I'm nobody." Elara reached across the space and for a fleeting moment rested her hand on Chloe's. Her touch was light, but it grounded Chloe in the surreal moment. Do not ever say that Elara said her voice firm, but kind. Richard and Marcus are somebodies. They have titles, reputations, fortunes. They see the world as a spreadsheet of assets and liabilities. They calculate, they leverage, they acquire. But they are blind. You see people. Tonight you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. That is not a skill you learn, Chloe. It is a fundamental part of who you are. And in my world, a world built on artifice and ambition, that gift is a superpower. I do not need another calculator in my life. I need someone who can see. Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. The years of being a quiet observer, of feeling like a ghost in her own life, had not been for nothing. It had all been training for this single moment. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air in the silent car, feeling charged with her future. She looked into Elara Vance's eyes and saw not a millionaire or a tech mogul, but a mentor, a kindred spirit. A new door was opening, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she had to walk through it. "Yes," Chloe said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Miss Vance, I would be honored." A brilliant, beautiful smile spread across Elara's face. "Elara," she corrected gently. "From now on, you will call me Elara." As she spoke, the car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into the river of traffic. Chloe looked out the window at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, their lights twinkling like a galaxy of earthbound stars. Just an hour ago, she had been a tiny, insignificant speck in that vast, indifferent city. Now, as the Rolls-Royce moved through the night, she felt like she was finally on her way to becoming one of them. The journey was just beginning. What you just heard wasn't just a story about a business deal. It's a story about the masks we wear, and the snap judgments we make every single day. It's about how we constantly underestimate the people around us, the quiet colleague in the office, the cashier at the grocery store, the waitress serving our table. We see a uniform, a job title, a silent exterior, and we fill in the rest with our own prejudices. But behind every pair of eyes is a universe of experience, a hidden strength, a voice waiting for the right moment to be heard. Ilara Vance wasn't a victim. She was a queen testing her court. And Chloe wasn't just a waitress. She was the only one worthy of entering it. If this story moved you and reminded you of the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness and perception, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories that reveal the incredible truth that heroes are all around us, often in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening.